Uh, I'm really under the weather today. My head hurts, my nose is running a marathon, and honestly, I think my immune system just rage quit. We've all used this phrase before when we're feeling sick, but have you ever stopped and thought, wait a second, what does that even mean? Like, am I literally under a cloud? Did the weather gods personally decide to smite me today? Who came up with this? Well, grab your raincoats and hop aboard, because today we're diving into the nautical origins of this everyday phrase, because, believe it or not, it comes straight from the high seas and the very miserable sailors who sailed them. These days, when someone says they're under the weather, we all know it means they're feeling awful. Maybe you've got the flu, maybe you pulled an all-nighter binge-watching TV, or maybe you made the terrible life choice of eating gas station sushi. Spoiler alert, that never ends well. But originally under the weather had nothing to do with colds or bad burritos. It was all about sailors trying not to throw up in the middle of a storm. Let's take a trip back in time, back when ships were made of wood and the open sea was a vast uncharted wilderness. Maps were vague suggestions at best, and if you got seasick, well, you were gonna suffer. The life of a sailor was not for the faint of heart. Imagine you're a sailor in the 1700s. The world is a different place, and the sea is both your home and your greatest adversary. You've been at sea for months, eating nothing but rock-hard biscuits and questionable salted meat. The food is barely edible, but it's all you have. And then a storm hits. The deck is pure chaos. The wind howls like a banshee, and the rain lashes down with a fury that seems almost personal. Rain is coming down sideways, stinging your skin like 1,000 tiny needles. The ship is rocking like an out-of-control amusement park ride. Every wave threatens to capsize the vessel, and you can feel the timbers groaning under the strain. The waves are so high they're basically ocean skyscrapers. Each one looms over the ship, a wall of water that seems insurmountable. And you're desperately trying to hold on to both the ship and your lunch. Your stomach churns with every violent lurch of the ship. Now, if you were really sick, either from the storm or because your stomach couldn't handle all that ocean motion, the best place to go was below deck, literally under the worst of the weather, where the ship's movements were slightly less violent and you had a better chance of keeping your footing, so you wouldn't get tossed overboard like an unlucky deck mop. The phrase "under the weather" comes from this very scenario, where sailors would retreat below deck to escape the worst of the storm. It's a vivid reminder of the harsh realities of life at sea and how language evolves from our experiences. Below deck, or the hold, wasn't exactly a spa retreat. It was dark, damp, and smelled like a combination of salt water, old fish, and unwashed sailors. The air was thick and musty, making it hard to breathe, and the lack of proper ventilation only made things worse. The cramped quarters meant that sailors had little to no personal space, often sleeping in hammocks that were stacked one above the other, swaying with the motion of the ship. The constant creaking of the wooden beams and the occasional scurrying of rats added to the overall discomfort. Despite these less than ideal conditions, the hold served as a refuge from the harsh elements above deck. But it was still better than getting thrown around on the stormy deck. The deck of the ship was a perilous place during rough weather. Waves would crash over the sides, drenching everything and everyone in their path. The wind howled like a banshee, making it difficult to hear anything, let alone follow orders. The ship would lurch and roll with the waves, making it nearly impossible to keep one's footing. Captains would often order sick sailors to go below deck to rest, as the risk of injury was significantly higher on the deck during a storm. The hold, while uncomfortable, provided a relatively stable environment where sailors could recover without the constant threat of being swept overboard. Because let's face it, a seasick sailor is useless on deck. Seasickness was a common affliction among sailors, especially those who were new to life at sea. The constant motion of the ship could wreak havoc on one's stomach, leading to nausea and vomiting. If they're sick with something worse than seasickness, like scurvy, the plague, or whatever terrifying 1700s disease was making the rounds, the situation became even more dire. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was particularly prevalent and could lead to symptoms like swollen gums, joint pain, and even death if left untreated. Other diseases, such as dysentery and typhus, spread quickly in the close quarters of the ship, making it essential to isolate the sick to prevent a full-blown outbreak. Keeping them away from the rest of the crew helped prevent a full-blown outbreak, so when a sailor wasn't feeling well, they were sent under the weather. This practice of isolating the sick was one of the few measures available to prevent the spread of disease on board. The term "under the weather" actually originates from this practice, as sailors who were ill were sent below deck away from the harsh weather and the rest of the crew. This not only helped in containing the illness, but also provided the sick sailor with a chance to rest and recover in a relatively stable environment. Out of the storm, away from the crashing waves and into a dark, slightly less chaotic part of the ship. And if you're wondering why sailors got sick so often, well, let's just say sanitation wasn't exactly a top priority back then. Hygiene standards were practically non-existent, with limited access to fresh water and no proper facilities for washing. The combination of poor diet, lack of cleanliness, and close quarters created a breeding ground for illness. Despite these challenges, sailors continued to brave the seas, driven by a sense of adventure, duty, or simply the need to make a living. The hold, with all its flaws, was a small sanctuary in the vast, unpredictable ocean. Like many sailors' sayings, this phrase didn't stay at sea. When sailors came back to shore, they kept using "under the weather" to describe feeling sick, and eventually, regular land dwellers started saying it too. By the 1800s, people were using it all the time, even if they'd never stepped foot on a boat, and now, centuries later, it's still one of the most common phrases we use, whether we're battling the flu or just trying to explain why we look like a zombie after a bad night's sleep. Me, every morning. Okay, before we wrap up, here are some bonus fun facts about this phrase. 1. The original phrase was way longer. Originally, sailors didn't just say "under the weather," they said "under the weather bow." This phrase was used to describe the side of the ship that was being hit the hardest by the wind and waves. The weather bow was the side of the ship getting hit hardest by wind and waves. Imagine being on a ship in the middle of a storm with the wind howling and the waves crashing over the bow. It was a place where the conditions were the most severe, and it was definitely not a spot you wanted to be in. So if you were under the weather bow, you were in the absolute worst spot on the ship. It was a term that sailors used to describe the most challenging and uncomfortable conditions they could face at sea. Over time, the phrase was shortened to just "under the weather," but the meaning remained the same. Over time, people just shortened it to "under the weather" because, let's be real, nobody wants to say extra words when they feel like garbage. The phrase became a way to describe feeling unwell or out of sorts, whether it was due to illness, exhaustion, or just a general sense of malaise. 2. It's not just about sickness. While we mostly use "under the weather" to describe feeling physically sick, sailors originally used it for anyone struggling in bad conditions. While we mostly use "under the weather" to describe feeling physically sick, sailors originally used it for anyone struggling in bad conditions, whether they were seasick, exhausted, or just emotionally done with everything. The phrase was a catch-all term for any kind of discomfort or hardship that sailors might experience while at sea, whether they were seasick, exhausted, or just emotionally done with everything. Life at sea was tough, and sailors had to deal with a lot of challenges, from rough weather to long hours and hard work. The phrase "under the weather" captured the sense of being overwhelmed and worn out by these conditions. Basically, if you were having a rough time at sea, you were under the weather. Relatable. So next time you say you're feeling under the weather, remember that you're tapping into a long history of sailors who faced some of the toughest conditions imaginable. It's a reminder that feeling unwell is a universal experience, whether you're on land or at sea. Now that you know the history, here are some great modern ways to use "under the weather." Calling in sick to work? Boom, I can't come in today, I'm under the weather. Stayed up too late watching TV? Easy. Man, I'm feeling under the weather today. Ate way too much at an all-you-can-eat buffet. Congratulations, you're now under the weather. Historically accurate excuses for all occasions. And there you have it, the true story behind feeling under the weather. So next time you're sick, you can impress your friends by saying, "I'm under the weather, just like an old sailor in a storm." Or if you really want to sound cool, throw in a "yah" for good measure. Or maybe don't. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss more weird and wonderful facts from history.